Even when you feel low, you can still go. Even when you feel slow, you can still go. Even when there's no hope, you can still go. I never answer to no, man, I still go. Go, 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 go.
Hello, RailCats fans, and welcome back to another edition of the RailCats Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Snovetich, and today we are going to do a monthly review of the month of May. Monthly review of May. I was debating on whether doing like a 20% or 25 or a monthly review. And I think I'm just going to probably stick with the monthly, and then depending on where like June and July and the 50 game mark hits, depending on how I'm going to do that one on that aspect of it. But with it being an off day here in the first day of June, it's a little bit easier doing a podcast as versus, and especially being on a Saturday versus the end of the month being, you know, in the middle of the week and them starting a game and that kind of stuff. So this one is a little bit easier to do it this way. It just kind of depends on where the season falls and what my schedule looks like for how I'm going to base it, like on a monthly or a percentage aspect of it, or a game percentage, but mostly a percentage of 25 and 25 games. Like the easy math, 100 makes it easy math for me at least. So without further ado, the RailCats are 6-15. They are last in the East and last in the American Association. You know, the 5-game losing streak at the beginning of the season didn't help, and then them now coming off another 5-game losing streak really doesn't help. When, you know, obviously you go 0-10, not winning again. You know, obviously they got 6 wins, but you know, in those 6 wins, that's the crazy thing. If you take away those 5-game losing streaks, right? If you just take those away, and at the pace they're at now, they're 6-5, right? If you just take those, it's a 6-5 record. So it's one of those, like, yeah, you still have to take an accountability of losing streaks, and you know that's obviously a part of the game. But you just take that aspect away. Any kind of winning or losing streak. I mean, I guess even if you take the 3-game winning streak away, you know, you're at 3-5. So still you're under the 500 mark. But I'm just saying, this team with the peaks and the valleys are there. And, you know, especially being the early month of May, it's kind of hard. It's not kind of hard. You're seeing the team that we have. You know, there are some teams that are going to come out really hot out of the gate, and the RailCats are not one of those teams. The pitching, I thought, you know, looking at the pitching, I was like, man, it's really on the defensive fault, or not the defense, the offensive side of this that's becoming an issue. Because when you look at the schedule and everything, you know, the RailCats been shut out 3 times in 21 games. They scored in 10 games, 3 or less runs. But then, you know, when you kind of look at the pitching side of things, 14 games where the opponent scored 5 or more runs, and only 7 games where the opponent scored 4 or less. On that aspect of it, the RailCats are 1-3 in one run games. It's one of those, I would say maybe at the beginning of the season, you know, you take the two Chicago games away from the little streak that they had, you know, obviously losing. I mean, the Milwaukee series could have gone either way. Like, that's one of those, like, if the RailCats were to would have won those 2 games, this might be a little bit different situation that we're necessarily in. I mean, we would be only an 8-13 record, you know, but that doesn't look as bad as being a 6-15 record, especially with how close the division quite necessarily is. Because when you look at the division standings right now, the RailCats realistically behind Lake Country Dockhounds are only 2.5 games. So like, that's not crazy. But then you get into the bulk of the playoff position, and you're sitting at 5 games behind Cleburne. And like I said, the next series that's coming up against Cleburne is going to be huge, because this is the time to make the ground is going to be in those. Because I mean, if you get a clean sweep in that, you're talking a 6-game winning streak, right? That, and I'm not saying I think that's going to happen, but if you take 4 of 2 out of that, or 5 of 1, you're gonna be setting yourself up for better success than you were earlier already. So like where they're at now, it's it's still tough because you still want to get to that 500 mark, but it's still early on in the season to where you can kind of correct your actions a little bit. And I think that this Cleburne series that's coming up is going to be a huge, like, you have to make sure that you're going to win this series. And granted, you have one more against Kansas City, so if you lose against Kansas City, you're looking at a 6-16 record versus a 17-15 record, which you necessarily want that other win. And I think looking at the two Kansas City games, you see two different kinds of Kansas City. And I think it's been well known and well said kind of around from Carter Waddell, just listening to Andrew talk about them, talking around everyone. And when I go to the games, talking around everyone there, it seems like they're very hit or miss. Like they're the peaks, like they're like the let's. I know I'm kind of going off track a little bit here, but it's my podcast. I'm gonna do what I want, right? So just kind of looking at Kansas City's schedule. I mean, they're 12-8. That's not what I pressed. They started out hot, and then they lost 2 in a row to Fargo. One game got postponed. Then they went on, like it seemed like they're the opposite of kind of what the RailCats have been. And I mean, they're beating up when you look at their division standings. Kansas City's second, 12-8, and they're kind of beating up on their own kind of division a little bit to a certain extent. But watching them in that first game, they didn't look like Miles Wolf Cup champions, and then in the second game, they looked like Miles Wolf Cup champions. I know the changes and everything like that. I'm just saying, I think they're a very like hit or miss team on like when they're really good, they're really good. When they're mediocre, they're gonna still be able to win some games, but when they're bad, they're like bad. And I think the issue with like the RailCats, for instance, is when they're on and they're on, they look like they could be one of the best teams in the league. But the issue is when they're mediocre, when like one side's doing better than the other, they're gonna lose more games than not. And then when they're low, like when both teams aren't, when both sides of the ball aren't working, both sides of the field, however you want to word that, aren't working, that's when things get really bad. And I think that's the issue, is there's the inconsistency between the pitching staff and the offensive side of things. But like, for instance, from yesterday's game or Friday's game, when you take in that game, you take out Sanabria's terrible start. I mean, that's I was talking with Chuck, and I said, if Sanabria has command of the ball, I think we're gonna win this game. And what does he do? He hits the first person he faces on the first pitch of the game, and just from there, it was just all downhill. Right, and I'll get into a series preview tomorrow, or a series review tomorrow. But that was one of those, like, if you take that 6 runs out, right? If you just take those 6 runs, the game going into the 9th inning would have been tied at 4. Right? Yeah, the offense came a little bit late, but like that's what you need to hold on for. Like, your pitching staff sometimes just needs to hold off just a little bit so your offense can get going. And when you go down 6-0, especially in the first inning, it's gonna take some time to get that back. And I mean, it's just like what happened in Monday's game, or not Monday's game. What day is it? Saturday. Thursday's game. There we go. Thursday's game, where the RailCats tack on 4 runs and 6 runs in the first 2 innings. Then Kansas City's a little bit down on themselves, right? And Anders Diaz came in and he pitched lights out. And sometimes you just need, sometimes you just have that happen. And, their pitcher started off a little bit rough, but then he got better throughout the game. And I'm not saying that Sanabria didn't necessarily get better. He only pitched, like 3 innings. But the point I'm getting to is this is where we're at. And when I start reading through all of like the statistical stuff, it's going to make a little bit more sense, because like you can say your eyes can kind of deceive you to a certain extent. That's why you're going to have to look at the numbers a little bit. And obviously when you're not hitting as much and you're not getting that offense production, I mean, that's not the offense, I'm not saying isn't an issue, but I'm just saying in some of these instances it's they've put themselves in a situation where the pitching and the defense side of things have put them in such a big hole that the offensive side doesn't look as good necessarily, because you're in that hole. There's a handful of games that are close and they're a little bit high scoring to a certain extent, but sometimes something doesn't hold on, and that's an issue. And so let's just kind of get into some of this stuff here. When I look at the individual batting averages for the RailCats, I just took like they had to play at least 15 games. I'll look at on the pitching side, I did the league standard, but here I just kind of based it off of kind of seeing where everyone's sort of at. It doesn't really matter because Marcos Gonzalez has played every game so far, and he has a batting average of 297. He has kind of been the unsung kind of hero to a certain extent, the type of player that has been consistent, who has the power, that has been driving in runs, that has also been scoring runs. He is kind of, at this point, I would say he's been our most offensive consistent player with the RailCats. I mean, you can also say Basabe as well, because he's just behind him. The home run total is only 2, and he's only 4 behind in the RBI aspect of it. And really, when we take the top 3 in the averages, a lot of these they're all kind of together in that certain aspect of Gio Diaz. He has 10 runs scored. He has 8 RBIs. He doesn't have any home runs, but I understand he's kind of getting moved down in the lineup, but with that move down in the lineup, I think that's actually helped him a little bit better. Just looking at the last couple of games, the last 2 games at least, him being in that 8 hole, he's gone 2 for 4, scoring 1 run, having a double and 2 RBIs. Like, I'm not saying, in that aspect of maybe just pulling him off of that number 1 spot, because I think I have my Marcos Gonzalez or Basabe was starting number 1. Sometimes I forget a lot of things. Gonzalez has been leading off, and you want that guy that's going to get on base, who's been your best offensive production guy sometimes to a certain extent. You could put, how should I say, I forget. I'm just kind of moving, thinking at the same time as talking about this. Okay, Rincon has been batting 4, so that would make sense that he would be your RBI producer, and that's what you kind of. I think that's something that the RailCats have kind of missed over the handful of. I know I say this, but Rincon is the leader in the RBI circle, and he's been a good cleanup hitter to a certain extent. So Marcos Gonzalez best batting average. There's a 3-way tie for runs scored. Marcos Gonzalez, Olivier Basabe, and Guillermo Quintana at 13. Most hits, Basabe at 23. Most doubles, Gio Diaz at 5. Triples, a 3-way tie between Brandon, Gio, and Quintana at 1. Most home runs, Carlos Rincon at 6. Most RBIs is Rincon at 14. Most walks, Guillermo Quintana at 10. Then least amount of strikeouts, a tie between Gio Diaz and Olivier Basabe is at 10. Most stolen bases at 6 is Gio Diaz. Only 2 players that um, that have qualified for that haven't committed an error that qualifies still under like that 15 game rule to a certain extent is Gio Diaz and Guillermo Quintana, which kind of is surprising to a certain extent that that he hasn't Quintana hasn't had an error quite necessarily yet. Now, granted, he really hasn't thrown out a lot of runners, so there hasn't been like a lot of wild throws. So, I'm not saying he's accurate when he throws down, but he's just not getting the ball down there. But we've kind of discussed that a little bit on that portion of it. For pitching, the league standard is 0.8 innings pitched, or 80%. So you have to pitch at least 80% of what the games have been played. So that roughly right now that would have been like 12.8 inning or 16.8 innings. So I rounded it down to 16 just to make it even on that part. Just because if someone has like 16.1 or 16 point, 16 and 2/3 innings, that kind of stuff. So the best ERA is going to be Anders Diaz at 2.74. Most starts Carlos Sanabria. Most games pitched Julio Pinto at 12. Most innings pitched Carlos Sanabria, and I didn't write down how many innings they pitched. He pitched 21.2 innings so far. Let's see. Chris Irwin has given up the least amount of hits at 15. He qualifies at that 16 inning mark. Least amount of runs given up was Chris Irwin at 6. Most pitchers with the least amount of walks is Anders Diaz and Ty Tiedemann. They both have given up, let's see here, 6. Yeah, 6 walks. Chris Irwin, Yohan Valdez, Ty Tiedemann, and Anders Diaz have one win on their record, which ties for the team lead. Carlos Sanabria has the least amount of whip with a 1.57, which is kind of ironic after the last game he had. So like his ERA or his whip before that was a lot less than it was this game. Really, he's had 2. Well, even I guess I would take that back. Most of the games that he's pitched in, which is kind of surprising. I mean, don't get me wrong, a 1.5 ERA is still up there. I mean, before going into that Kansas City game, he had a 1.2 whip. So like he was still being really productive at the, it's a little bit high, but that's kind of like leaguish average on that front. Looking at the RailCats offensive ranking, runs scored 11th at 88. They've scored 88 runs. Hits, they have 159. That's 7th in the league. Doubles are last at 19. Triples are tied with 6 other teams at 3rd necessarily. Are tied at 3 triples with 6 other teams, ranking it at kind of like at 4th, however you want to word that one. Tied with 2 other teams at 20 home runs, that ranks 3rd. RBIs 11th at 80. Walks 11th at 59. Strikeouts. When I do strikeouts, it's the least amount of strikeouts. So number 1 has the least amount of strikeouts. So they are ranked 5th at 160 stolen bases, 11. That's rough, because when I look at the league stats, right? When you look at the league stats and you scroll over to team batting totals, and you go to the next page over and you go to stolen bases, the RailCats have 11, and that's something that you're just not quite used to. I mean, there's two other teams that are below 20, and that's Milwaukee and Cleburne. Kind of wish that total was a little higher up on that aspect of it, especially you kind of now. Granted, you're missing Jesus Mariaga, who was a speedster. You don't really have a lot of those speedsters that you kind of had last year to a certain extent. So I can understand that you're substituting the speed for the power. but also we're also in a league to where that should be a higher, Lake Country right now has 43, Sioux Falls has 40. There's a lot of that, and that's only in a handful of games, 20% of the way through the season, and you're sitting at 11. Like you kind of need, but you also have to kind of get on base in order for that to happen. And there's a lot of times where that doesn't necessarily happen. On base percentage last at 299, slugging 10th at 356, average last at 232. When we're looking at the pitch rankings, runs given up, that's yet again, it's sorted from least to most. They rank 11th at 113 runs given up. When you only score, this is where it kind of gets a little weird. When you only score 88 runs and you give up 113, obviously that's not a key for success on that portion of it. When you look here, a lot of the teams that the pitching totals, that are higher up, like let's just take Lake Country right now. They're last, but that's like the offense of production and runs scored is ninth, 10th, however. I think I ranked at ninth. No, well, my bad. Oh, how did I? Oh, I don't have it. Sorry, my bad. I didn't have it sorted correctly. So yeah, they're 10th in 113, but then like Lake Country is last at 119. But when you get in, I'm sorry, that's the pitching totals. That's the pitching totals. When you go to the batting totals, the RailCats, the most runs scored at 11 at 88, but like you have some of these other teams like Lake Country has 95 runs scored. They've given up. I kind of contradict myself a little bit on this one. They're also, Chicago, for example, the amount of runs that they gave or that they've given up is 80, and they're scoring 82. Like that's a better win production to a certain extent. Kansas City team totals, like let's just Sioux Falls, for example. They are leading the West, at least. They have 94 runs scored as a team, and then pitching total wise, they've only given up 79, right? So realistically, like I said, talking about Sioux Falls and Chicago and Kansas City and Winnipeg, they have really good pitching staffs, so they can kind of scrape by if an offense is kind of lacking to a certain extent. And at this point in the year, the offense is going to take maybe a bit of a back seat just because they're trying to get used to everything. And the numbers might jump around a little bit, but a little bit more. I don't really think, like I was saying, these numbers are close to a certain extent on the pitching side of things. Obviously, when you're giving up more runs than you're actually, I'm just saying what I guess ultimately what I'm getting to is that just because the offense necessarily doesn't have the best runs scored necessarily doesn't mean that you still couldn't be winning games. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to get to, is when you're giving up more runs, sometimes it's those close games where you're not scoring a lot of runs, but you're also not giving up a lot of runs. And like when you're losing, you're giving up more runs than not. Like that's kind of the issue that they're running into, is those close games that they could be winning, they're giving those up, vice versa, instead of winning them. I know it kind of sounds like a word salad to a certain extent, but when you kind of look at it, it makes more sense on that portion of it. So when we go into hits, they have given up the most hits at 182, walks that rank 10th at 91, strikeouts that rank 9th at 160. They only have one save on the year. Home runs, they're tied for 4th at 16 given up, so that's a positive to a certain extent. Their WHIP, they're last, or not last, they're 11th at a 152. ERA, they're 9th at 491. Defense, they're tied at 5th at 978. And they're tied at 7 with 17 errors. So, obviously, this is a team that's not necessarily clicking on all cylinders, right? And when you're not clicking on all cylinders, when we just kind of look through their schedule, you know, the one series that you could probably, the one series you probably really want back is probably the Milwaukee series, because you played 3 really good games, right? And you lost by a walk-off, right? The hitting necessarily wasn't there to a certain extent, but the pitching was there. And like those are the two that if you were to win those two and maybe reverse, came around and you were even at 500, that would have been one of those situations where you're like, okay, we should be fine. And then like I said, you come in and then you take out Lake Country, which realistically, I mean, that's your competition to a certain extent. I guess even if you look at the division standing, Cleburne is there as well, and that's the next series you're facing. You just look through and you miss a couple opportunities. Anything really outside of the division, I can kind of care less for to a certain extent. It's the big losing streak at the beginning of the season with everyone, but it also it didn't. You weren't terrible. You weren't so far off because you were still when they lost those 5 games, and they ended up winning. Having that 3-game winning streak, they were only like 2 games out of the playoff spot. And so it was one of those like, okay, we got to build momentum. Okay, you lose the 1 game against Lake Country, 10-0. That was just a toss me up, throw me away game. Those games happen, right? And then you come in and you face the Sioux City, and that was your testament to kind of they're from the other side. They're from the West. They're kind of similar situation you are. They're not. They have pieces, but they don't have a crazy team. They were kind of evenish not record wise, but kind of along the lines of the same thing. And you play really three good games to a certain extent. I think that Monday game was kind of it was one of those where Sioux City kind of just took control a little bit early, and it was that the day game where he had a rough go at it, but the offense just couldn't, the runs given up just was too much for the offense to kind of necessarily handle. And then that was just an intense series. You had 2 bench clearings, that kind of stuff. And then you play, you win an 8-15 game, and then you have the Wednesday game, the 12-9 loss, and it was a back and forth situation, where you jumped on them early, and then they hung around. So when they had their big innings, it hurt the RailCats. And I think that's the biggest issue with the RailCats necessarily, is that when you go through most of the outside of like game 1, game 2, for example, the RailCats have really one bad inning in the 6th, and that's where the fault in the pitching staff is they can be consistent at throwing up donuts on the board, and then they can kind of be a little consistent with just throwing up a breadstick, just 1 run, not terrible, but it's those 1 inning games that they have where everything just falls apart. And I think that's the biggest issue is you gain momentum, your offense maybe not quite there, but then you have that 1 really bad inning, and when you have that really 1 bad inning, it just takes everything else away from the situation, and it makes it harder for the RailCat, or for the offense, to pick themselves up because they know, just for example, the Friday game, you're down 10-0, and you're like, where there's just no fight. I mean, you go down 6-0 and there's just no fight. You're instead of playing the let's play baseball, you're playing let's swing for the fences game. So you're being more aggressive because you're trying to get on, but then you finally calm down, but it's too late. You score 4 runs in the 7th inning and you have 2, and you just don't have anything else left to give at that point. So it's just one of those situations where when you look at the month of May so far, you can fault. I'm not necessarily going to fault the defense to a certain extent. I think we're going to fault more of the offense and the pitching side just not collaborating well enough. And, you see a couple changes. Will Decker gets released. Noriega gets traded for Galeno. And I think that was just more of a that was Galeno, or Noriega just wasn't playing. He probably wanted to play, so it was just a trade to trade. It was hard to take Guillermo out of the lineup because he was on the on base hitting streak, the on base or the hitting streak, whatever the case is. It's harder to take someone out of the lineup when they're producing to a certain extent. And then on the pitching side of it, you see DNA Olivero. He goes to the Mexican League, which I that kind of hurts the RailCats to a certain extent. But then Anders Diaz, he has the 1 start rough, and then he has the 2nd start, which is a lot better, which I think is fine at that point. You see Ryan Munoz, he gets released. Vitriago gets released. You see Piazza come in. You get Walda that comes in, and then you get Hall that also comes in. Walda, I think outside of like the 4 walks that he has 3 strikeouts. He's given up 2 runs in 2.2 innings. Really, that came on the one that came against the Kansas City, where they've already they already tacked on the 2 runs. Basically, they were already winning at that. They had 8 runs, I think, at that point. So he just tacked on. They just tacked on 2 more, whatever the case may be. You really blame him on that one? No, not really. I don't necessarily blame him. That was already a blowout game, so it just kind of whitewashed that one away. The first game he played against Sioux Falls, where he struck out three batters, he got 4 outs in a row. He pitched 1 2/3 innings. I think he looked a lot better. The one that I'm kind of concerned about is Denson Hall. Granted, outside he gave up 1 run. It's the walks that kind of concern me, because I'm pretty sure he walked someone in. Granted, he pitched 2 2/3 innings, only giving up 1 run and 1 walk. I think there was a couple hit by pitches in there. I think I'm not 100% positive on that portion of it. It's a control issue. I don't like it's the control issue as far as walks when you don't need walks, or not attacking hitters when you should be attacking hitters. I think Ty Tiedemann's, he's been bit by he's a contact hitting pitcher. He's not a strikeout pitcher, and Sioux Falls lit him up, or most teams have lit him up, not like scoring a crap ton of runs, but they're putting balls, or not sure, lighting him up as far as they're not taking the ball and they're not flying out of the ballpark, but he's giving up hits, which sometimes when you give up those soft hits, it's going to bring in a run or 2. I think there's been a handful of times of terrible base running. Valera had 1 game where he lost his marbles and thought he could go from second to home with the ball being hit right in front of the center fielder. Brandon Fields had his first game his first game where he was really productive, got his first major league hit, and he has 2 terrible base running decisions. those are two possible games where you could have won. You could have won those games, and you lost those games. So like you could have gotten out of the slump earlier, but you decided to have terrible base running, or the pitching having one bad inning and it just blowing everything up, or the hitting when the pitching's there, the hitting's just not there. I just it's one of those, like, when I look at here, I like what Josh Smith right now technically has the lowest ERA at 1.80, and he's played in 9 games, pitched in 10 innings. He has 13 strikeouts. I like him. Valdez, when you look at his hits, he's given up 8 hits and half of them been doubles. That's kind of hard. Irwin's not having Irwin-esque like year. I think a lot of that still has to do with the injury and him not, I think he should have had at least a win or two in his and he has at least one win. I think he should have had another one, but I know that he got taken out early in the game. Nate Alexander, he was bit a little bit early on. He's 0-3, but I think he was bit a little bit on just like soft contact kind of hits on that portion of it. And maybe the walks, he gives up 6 walks. That's that's a big one. I think Peyton Long really had the one the one really bad game against Lake Country. They lost 10-0. Outside of that, I think he's pitched really well for the ball club. Franklin Perez is probably another one of those that, like, if he doesn't get his stuff together, I think he's the next one to kind of go. I granted, I get that he was ranked super high. He was traded for Justin Verlander. I get it. I get it. I understand that. But when you've pitched 5.2 innings, you've given up 11 hits, you've given up 10 runs, every time you've touched the mound, you have given up 2 runs per inning, is basically where we're at on this. So he's one of those where it's like, okay, are you going to show something other than, he had the really one good game against Lake Country where he gave up 1 hit, 1 walk, 2 strikeouts, and his stuff looked good. He pitched 2 innings. Outside of that, it just hasn't been there. That's a concern, and that's another one of those where it's like, okay, he could be one of those guys that's on the next trip out. But I don't know. Like I said, the issue that we're running into is that a lot of these players that are necessarily getting released or traded, or the case, really don't have any sort of connection to Lamar Rogers, right? Franklin Perez has connections to Lamar Rogers. The next person I'm going to talk about who's injured right now is another person on the cusp of you probably need to go, because when Jesus Mariaga comes back, like, I don't think you're going to have a spot. And that's Miguel Sierra, and I know he has connections with Lamar Rogers. Like, I get some of these players have connections with Lamar Rogers, and it's not a organizational person saying, okay, you gotta get rid of this guy. It's you're saying this, you're running the show, and you already have that kind of personal connection with them. That's the kind of hard part about having a personal or a coaching relationship with the person, because you're kind of blinded by the situation. Like, I get it. Franklin Perez, you want to give him that opportunity, right? And that opportunity, you gave those opportunities in the Friday game to the newer guys to see what they can do, because that's the situations you kind of want to put them in. You don't want to put them in a situation where it's a 3-2 game and you're winning, and you're going to put them out there, in that situation and you put them in that situation. If they fail, then you know that you're going to have to kind of keep them at that role. If you're up by a lot of runs or you're down by a lot of runs, you don't want to keep, you're trying to, find a place role for them in that instance. But, like with Franklin, I mean, the first game that he pitched in, the RailCats were winning 1-0, and they had that really rough inning, and that really rough inning started with Franklin Perez giving up 5 runs in 2 1/3 innings. Like, he was one of those people that I like for his first start or his first appearance coming out of, injury and coming back into baseball. That's a situation where it's like, okay, why did you put him in that situation? You could have put someone else in a better situation, or someone that has been reliable in that situation, like a Yohan Valdez. Like, you utilized him last year in those kind of situations and pitched him in longer innings. Those were kind of those situations that you wanted to put him in. I get that you want to instill the trust, but it's one of those, like, you just don't know the kind of stuff that Franklin's going to bring out of it. The other person that I was talking about is going to be Miguel Sierra, who right now has the worst average on the team. He has a 128 average. He's injured right now because supposedly, or it could be conspiracy theory, that he decided that he wasn't going to stretch before a game, and he got a hamstring injury. And then with Francisco Del Valle coming back into the lineup, you look at the outfield with Brandon Fields, and he's been productive. You look at the infield between Marcos Gonzalez and Gio Diaz, and you're saying, okay, you're going to take one of those guys out of the lineup for a 128 batter? I wouldn't. I mean, granted, right now, Francisco Del Valle is batting a 182, but he just started. And even if when Jesus Mariaga comes back in, he could start batting a 300. Are you going to take him out of the outfield? Probably not. And so you're gonna risk your number 1 and your number 3 batting average person. And he has 20 strikeouts. That's second versus LG Castillo, but at least LG Castillo has been producing. LG has 7 runs, 20 hits, 12 RBIs. Sierra has 5 RBIs, 6 hits, 4 runs scored, and 2 home runs. He has home runs, but it's just one of those situations like, when are you going to produce? And if you produce, yeah, that's fine, but a 128, that's, you're not even looking at a hit every five at bats. So it's just one of those situations where could you I just don't know. There's a couple players that I kind of feel for that you could have used in a trade asset to a certain extent. I think that, you have a Jacob Bockley and Jose Contreras, who both have ability to hit the ball and be good ball players. And they both only have played in 10 games, so basically half the games to a certain extent. You could have traded one of those players for a better quality pitcher to a certain extent. Not saying that the people that we've brought in haven't necessarily been bad, but it's just one of those situations where, or do you take a package deal somehow that, maybe like a Kansas City, the reason they released Nicholas Piazza was because they needed another position player to a certain extent. But maybe it's one of those where you look at teams around, and if they have a certain position that has too many people in it, and they have a position that does, maybe they're lacking in the first base department or infield department. you combine those two together and you trade them, and you get an outfielder or something along the lines of that, or another pitcher, or maybe a starting pitcher. I take those two and get a quality starting, maybe someone that's in the middle of the rotation or the back end of a really good pit, I'm not saying like a Sioux, but I'm saying like a Sioux Falls aspect of a team, or something, taking players and combining them with a reason behind it to a certain extent. So I don't know, where that's just kind of where my observations kind of are, that I see a team that just isn't clicking. It's like at the last podcast or whatever it was, the same song, different band to a certain extent. Uh, I think the biggest issue with like the offensive side of things is the team isn't patient enough. You see the strikeouts, you see the swings, the pop ups, the weak dribblers, there's no hard, some of these players, like Gio Diaz, he's only struck out 10 times, and he has 84 at bats. He hits the ball, but he's been hitting the ball at people. Like, there's sometimes you just can't do anything about that. But it's the pop ups or the double plays, or it's just the inning killing strikeouts, the looking strikeouts, the let's complain about the strike zone instead of just adjusting the strike zone. Taking the game for what it is, or whatever the case may be. Just I just think that the way we are now, the way the league is now isn't like it was a couple years ago, where you could hit yourself out of every situation. If you had a bad pitching staff, you could hit yourself out of that. You can't do that anymore. So granted, the pitching staff, there are certain players and certain innings that have happened that I would say, yeah, this is an issue. But consistently overall, if you take the game in a whole, if you take the game in the whole situation, majority of the time it's like the offense just doesn't do anything. But then you take a sliver, right, a sliver of the game, and you look at the 6 runs that the offense or the pitching staff gave up. You're like, well, it's understandable. It's just not. It's not. The pitching isn't spread out. It's not 2 runs here, 2 runs there, 2 runs here, 2 runs there. It's not a lot of back and forth. The offense scores, the defense or the pitching gives up. It's both teams are shutting the team out, shutting, and then the RailCats get lit up, and then it goes back to the way it was. Like, there's it's a peak, and then it just levels itself back out. There's not a lot of back and forth. This team scores this, and that team scores that, and they come back, and they come back. You're like, I don't know how many times that I've, tweeted or Facebooked or whatever, just giving score updates, and it's no score changed, or the RailCats score 4 runs in this inning, and then it's no change, and then the team scores 1 run, but then the RailCats score 1 run. So it's like, it's not that big of a deal. Or it's the team scores 6 runs, and then the RailCats don't score anything until the 4th inning. They score 4 runs, but they're already down 10-0. Like, if those bad innings, the bad innings are outweighing the team in general, right? If you're going along the lines of, I think that's why most people, I'm just sitting there, and I think outside of a handful of us, when they look at the team, they're blaming more of the offense than the pitching side of things, just because of the lack of run production throughout the entire game. That's something that the lack of running, but like, that's the lack of consistency throughout the game, and that's hindering the offense. it's hard to go out and win a game when you just gave up, when you've been sitting on the field for 30 minutes giving up 6 or 7 runs, or your pitcher's walking everyone around. And it's just, that's the part that I think is missing out of the entire picture, is those little bitty ins and outs of the game. I'm not saying that, granted, there's been opportunities, the slugging's not there, you're not hitting doubles, you're not hitting triples, you're hitting home runs, but you're not scoring on those predicted, and the lack of stealing bases and other things like that. There's a lot that goes into it, but I'm just saying, on the side of, when you take each of the departments in full, and you look at the offensive side of things, and that instead of trying to score 1 or 2 runs in an inning, you're trying to score 7 runs in an inning, because your pitching staff had one terrible inning, and it's maybe taking this. The team has been like this for the past 2 years in general. Was the pitching staff would hold on, and then the offensive side would finally kick in, and the games would be close, right? You're not really getting that. The pitching staff has kind of fallen off to a certain extent, because they're giving up runs in bigger innings. It's not saying that the pitching staff is necessarily worse than it was in years past. It's saying that those opportunities, when they are there, the numbers are inflated because the innings are inflated. As far as last year, your starter gave up 3 runs in 5 innings, and then the last 4 innings you gave up another 3 runs, right? It's kind of spread itself out, but that gives your time for your offense to kind of, you give up 3 runs in 4 innings or 5 innings, you could do that as well. Or, you get a couple runs there, and you're only down by 2 runs going into the bullpen, and their bullpen may maybe not be strong. It gives you that time to kind of catch up. But when the offense, when the defensive pitching blows up, and you give up 6 runs, and the starting pitcher for the opposing team is going scoreless, they're able to go scoreless 7 innings instead of bringing in the bullpen arms, which you want to try to get to the bullpen, because majority of the time once you get to the bullpen, that's when the pitching kind of goes down a tad bit, right? And you kind of see that to a certain. That's why I think in the years past that the team has it has been a better the offense is better that way to a certain extent. Now I'm just starting to get into rambling mode here. Now I'm just starting. We're going almost an hour into this. I'm getting into the rambling mode. But it was nice to have a nice longer conversation, to a certain extent. Just kind of looking into the month of June. We start off the 2nd against Kansas City. You play the 6 games at Cleburne, which realistically would rather play Cleburne now, because of the weather that's eventually going to get there. Rather play them earlier. It's better at that point, because the temp. It'll be warm, but it's not going to be stupid hot. So that's a positive. But the schedule's not really going to get much easier from there. All the teams you're going to face in June: Cleburne for 6. Then you're on a homestand against Milwaukee, then Lincoln, and then you go to Winnipeg. Then you play Lincoln again. And then you see Kane County comes back. Winnipeg comes. That when you see Winnipeg twice, that's your month of June basically. It is all those. I don't see any kind of weird anything crazy like that. And really, to take out of the situation, I guess they did have a break. Yeah, I guess they did have one break. But they're still that meaty part of May. You play 3 games, you have a break, then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 games in 14 days. That's a lot of games to be playing, right? So, like, you kind of understand. But, like, you were being more productive, and then you have the break, and then you go into that losing, or I guess you're kind of in that middle of that losing streak when you had that break. No, well, take that back. You got swept by Sioux Falls, but that's what I'm saying. They played a lot of games. I'm not saying that they played a lot of games in a short amount of time. Maybe once they start getting into consistent schedule, where now we're off on Mondays and you play 6 games and you're off. You play 6 games, you're off. You're not having those crazy. You're playing 3 games and then you're playing 15 games straight. So like maybe you're gonna have a little bit of a break there. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm still looking at doing a series review into a preview, and then doing the RailCats Quick Minute. I think that just gives it a little bit better updates to a certain extent, just to kind of give a quick recap of the game, just kind of take the meaty parts of the game and throw it in. If you're enjoying those, let me know. If you think there's something different I should do, just let me know. I want to try to keep it under a minute, because you can do like the stories and the shorts and all that. If that's all under a minute, that just gets out, and more people are going to be more willing to watch that to a certain extent. So, but that's going to wrap it up for me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, rest of your evening, whenever you're watching this, and go Cats.
The 0-2. Swing and a miss, strike 3. Wrap this one up in green and white.